Hello there, my dear friend. Sit with me for a while. The world outside grows quiet now, and it's time for us to share something precious, something that has sustained humanity through its darkest hours and brightest dawns. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. There are nights when we all need to remember that we are not alone in this vast universe. Even when life feels heavy, when we face our struggles in solitude, there are bonds that transcend time, distance, and circumstance. Tonight, I want to tell you about those bonds, about friendship, true friendship, the kind that the Stoics understood so well. You see, my friend, the ancient philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, they knew something profound about connection. They understood that we are not islands unto ourselves. We are threads in a vast tapestry, each thread strengthening the whole. And when we find those rare souls who truly see us, who accept us completely, who stand beside us not for what we can give, but simply because we are, that is when we touch something divine. Tonight, I want to share 3 stories with you. Stories about friendship that goes beyond convenience, beyond obligation, beyond the shallow bonds that often pass for connection in our busy world. These are tales of souls who discovered what it means to be truly known, truly accepted, truly valued for who they are at their core. So settle in now. Let your body sink into comfort. Let your breathing slow and deepen. And let me tell you about a merchant who discovered which of his friends were genuine, about a doctor who extended healing hands to those who had wronged him, and about an old woman who found family in the most unexpected places. 3 stories, 3 souls, 3 lessons about the sacred art of true friendship. Close your eyes now and let your heart open to these tales of connection, of loyalty, and of the love that binds us all together. The year was 1847, and the Mediterranean winds carried both the salt of distant seas and the bitter taste of economic uncertainty. In the bustling port city of Marseille, where ships from across the world came bearing exotic goods and whispered rumors, lived a merchant named Constantine Papadakis. His shop, Papadakis and Sons, occupied a prime corner near the old harbor, its windows displaying fine silks from the east, spices that made the air thick with promise, and precious stones that caught the light like captured stars. Constantine was a man in his early 40s, his beard streaked with premature silver that spoke of years spent making difficult decisions under pressure. His eyes, dark and intelligent, had seen both great prosperity and crushing loss. He dressed well, fine woolens and silk waistcoats that reflected his success. But there was something in his bearing, a certain wariness, that suggested a man who had learned not to trust easily. The Papadakis family had been merchants for 3 generations. Constantine's grandfather had arrived in Marseille as a poor Greek immigrant, speaking little French but with dreams as vast as the sea. Through hard work and shrewd business sense, he had built a modest but profitable trade business. Constantine's father had expanded it, adding precious goods and establishing connections across Europe. And Constantine himself had brought it to new heights, becoming one of the most respected merchants in the port. But in the winter of 1847, the world was changing rapidly. Political upheaval in France had created uncertainty. New trade routes were opening, railroads were changing how goods moved. And most importantly, economic panic was spreading across Europe like wildfire. Banks were failing. Merchants were going bankrupt. Credit was becoming scarce, and trust even scarcer. Constantine had weathered many storms, but this felt different. His ledger books, which had always shown healthy profits, now revealed troubling trends. Several of his regular customers had defaulted on payments. His largest investment, a shipment of silks from Constantinople, had been delayed by political unrest and was now stranded in quarantine. His creditors were calling in debts, demanding immediate payment on loans that had been routine before. The most pressing problem was immediate. He needed 15,000 francs within 3 days to pay his supplier in Genoa for the winter shipment of spices that had just arrived. Without this payment, not only would he lose the goods and the money he'd already invested, but his reputation would be damaged beyond repair in a business where trust was everything. Constantine sat in his office on a gray Tuesday morning in February. The ledger spread before him like a verdict. The numbers didn't lie. His personal savings, everything he had worked for, would cover barely half of what he owed. His family home, inherited from his father, was worth something, but selling it would take months, and he needed cash in days. He had tried everything. His bank manager, Monsieur Dubois, had been sympathetic but firm. The bank's policy has changed, Monsieur Papadakis. We cannot extend further credit without substantial collateral. The other merchants he'd approached had shaken their heads, their own troubles mounting. If I had the money to lend, they'd said, I'd be keeping it for myself. As he sat there, staring at columns of figures that spelled potential ruin, Constantine's mind turned to his friends. Not acquaintances or business associates, but men he considered true friends. Men he had helped over the years. Men whose families he knew. Men who had shared meals in his home and whose children had played with his own. There was Henri Beaumont, the wine merchant from Bordeaux. Constantine had helped Henri establish connections in the Greek wine trade 5 years ago, when Henri was struggling to compete with larger importers. They had worked together on several deals, and Constantine had often given Henri favorable terms when cash was tight. Henri had promised loyalty in return. There was Francois Moreau, the shipowner, whose vessels had carried Constantine's goods for over a decade. Francois had been struggling with his own financial difficulties, but Constantine had always paid his freight charges promptly, often in advance. When Francois had needed to borrow money to repair a damaged ship 2 years ago, Constantine had provided it without hesitation. Francois had called him brother and promised that if he ever needed anything, he could count on him. There was also Pierre Dubois, no relation to his banker, a young lawyer who had helped Constantine navigate some complex legal matters with his suppliers. Constantine had paid Pierre well for his services, but more than that, he had introduced him to several wealthy clients who needed legal advice. Pierre had often said that Constantine had been instrumental in establishing his practice, and that he owed his success to Constantine's kindness and generosity. And there was Jean-Paul Mercier, a fellow merchant who had become a close friend over 15 years of business together. They had shared information about markets, sometimes cooperated on large orders, and even invested together in a new trading company. When Jean-Paul's wife had been ill 2 years ago, Constantine had visited her regularly and had sent the finest medicines from his supplier in Italy. Jean-Paul had said that Constantine's friendship had been a lifeline during that difficult time. These were men Constantine trusted, men he had helped, men who had given him every reason to believe they would stand by him now. With a heavy heart but growing hope, Constantine began to write letters. Each one was careful, dignified, explaining his temporary difficulty without revealing the full extent of his crisis. He asked for loans of varying amounts that together would solve his immediate problem. He offered reasonable interest rates and promised payment within 6 months, once his current shipment was sold and his financial situation stabilized. The first response came from Henri Beaumont 2 days later. Constantine opened it with trembling hands, expecting to find either a check or at least a sympathetic response. Instead, he found a brief note. "My dear Constantine, I am sorry to hear of your difficulties. Unfortunately, the wine business has been particularly challenging this season, and I'm unable to extend any loans at this time. I trust you will understand. Your friend, Henri." The words struck Constantine like a physical blow. Henri had seemed so prosperous in their last meeting just weeks ago. He had spoken of expanding his business, new opportunities. Yet now, when Constantine needed help, suddenly the wine business was struggling. Still, Constantine tried to remain optimistic. Perhaps Henri really was having difficulties. Perhaps the others would prove more helpful. Francois Moreau's response arrived the next day. It was longer than Henri's, more detailed and infinitely more crushing. "My dear friend Constantine, your letter came at the worst possible time. As you know, shipping has been devastated by the recent storms. 2 of my ships sustained serious damage, and repair costs have drained my reserves. I would love to help you, my friend, but I'm barely keeping my own business afloat. Perhaps in a few months, when things improve." Constantine read the letter 3 times, trying to absorb its implications. Francois had seemed fine just last month, even talking about purchasing a new ship. But now, when Constantine needed help, Francois's business was in crisis. The timing seemed too convenient. Pierre Dubois' response was the most devastating of all. It arrived on the morning of the 3rd day, Constantine's deadline for payment. Pierre's letter was written on expensive paper, the kind he used for important clients. The handwriting was careful, almost formal. "Dear Monsieur Papadakis, I have received your correspondence regarding your current financial situation. After careful consideration, I must decline your request for a loan. The legal profession has been experiencing its own challenges, and I cannot afford to risk any capital at this time. I trust you will understand the necessity of this decision. Respectfully, Pierre Dubois." The cold formality of Pierre's response stung more than the others. He had gone from calling Constantine his friend and benefactor to addressing him as Monsieur Papadakis. The man who had promised eternal gratitude now treated him like a stranger, making an unwelcome business proposal. As the morning of his deadline arrived, Constantine sat in his office with 3 rejection letters before him. The 4th friend, Jean-Paul Mercier, had not responded at all. Perhaps he was out of town. Perhaps his mail had been delayed. Constantine tried to convince himself that there was still hope, but deep down, he knew the truth. In the space of 3 days, he had learned something about friendship that no amount of success or prosperity had ever taught him. When the sun was shining, when prosperity was flowing, these men had been eager to call him friend. They had welcomed his help, enjoyed his generosity, promised their loyalty. But when shadows fell, when adversity struck, when the simple act of returning kindness was required, suddenly they had other priorities. Constantine closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing. His supplier would be expecting payment that afternoon. His employees would be expecting their wages. His family would be expecting dinner and shelter. Yet his friends had chosen their own security over their friendship with him. As he sat there, contemplating the failure of everything he had thought he knew about loyalty and connection, a gentle knock came at his office door. He looked up, expecting to see his clerk with bad news about the supplier. Instead, he saw a figure he recognized but hadn't expected. Standing in his doorway was Theodoros Alexandros, a Greek immigrant who had arrived in Marseille 5 years earlier with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of hope. Theodoros had been barely more than a street sweeper when Constantine first met him, helping to clear the gutters near the port. But there had been something in the young man's eyes, intelligence, determination, a spark of potential, that had caught Constantine's attention. Theodoros had started by doing small errands for Constantine's shop, carrying messages, helping with inventory, cleaning. Gradually, he had proven himself reliable, honest, and eager to learn. Constantine had begun teaching him about the import business, showing him how to evaluate goods, how to negotiate with suppliers, how to maintain relationships with customers. Over the years, their relationship had evolved. Theodoros had become more than an employee. He had become like a son to Constantine, who had no children of his own. Constantine had paid for Theodoros to learn French properly. He had helped him establish his own small business, a modest import concern specializing in goods from Greece. He had introduced him to suppliers and customers, sharing his network freely. Theodoros had shown his gratitude not through grand gestures, but through constant, quiet loyalty. He had worked long hours without complaint. He had refused to leave when other businesses tried to poach him. He had handled Constantine's affairs with the same care he would have given his own. When Constantine had faced minor difficulties in the past, Theodoros had quietly worked extra hours, taken on additional responsibilities, and asked for nothing in return. But their relationship had never been based on economics alone. They had shared meals, had conversations about philosophy and religion, had supported each other through personal difficulties. When Theodoros's mother had died in Greece the previous year, Constantine had given him time off to travel home and had even provided money for the journey. When Constantine's father had passed away 2 years ago, Theodoros had sat with him through the night of mourning and had helped with the funeral arrangements. Mr. Papadakis, Theodoros said now, his Greek accent still strong, despite years of speaking French. He held an envelope in his hands. I received your letter. Constantine felt his heart sink further. Even Theodoros was going to disappoint him. Even the person he had treated like family was going to choose his own interests over their friendship. I understand, Constantine said quietly. You don't need to explain. I know your business is still small, and you can't afford to take risks. But Theodoros shook his head, stepping forward and placing the envelope on Constantine's desk. Mr. Papadakis, I received your letter, but I did not write a response. I came here to tell you in person that I have withdrawn all the money from my business account. Constantine stared at the envelope, then at Theodorus's face. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that you have been more than a boss to me. You have been my teacher, my mentor, my family. When I arrived in this country with nothing, you saw something in me worth developing. You gave me opportunities. You taught me your business. You trusted me with your affairs. You helped me establish my own company. And you have been my guide through every challenge." Theodorus's voice grew stronger as he continued. "My business is small, but it is profitable. I have saved money for the future, for expansion, for emergencies. But what could be more important than helping the man who made everything I have achieved possible?" He gestured to the envelope. "There is 18,000 francs inside. It is more than you asked for in your letter, but I wanted to make sure you had enough to cover all your immediate needs. It is everything I have, but I give it freely, with no expectation of return." Constantine felt tears gathering in his eyes. "Theodorus, I cannot accept this. This is your life's work, your security." "You gave me life in this country," Theodorus interrupted. "You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me purpose when I was lost. What is money compared to that? I can earn more money. I can build another business. But I cannot find another Constantine Papadakis to guide me and believe in me." He sat down across from Constantine, his young face earnest and determined. "When my mother died, you gave me money for the journey home. When my business was struggling in its first year, you found customers for me and taught me how to serve them better. When I needed advice about anything, business, life, family, you have always been there. You never asked for payment for that advice. You never expected anything in return. You helped me simply because you believed I was worth helping." Theodorus reached across the desk and placed his hand over Constantine's. "Now it is my turn to believe in you. Now it is my turn to help you. Not because I owe you. Friendship is not about debt, but because this is what friends do. This is what family does." For several moments, Constantine could not speak. The magnitude of this gesture, the complete selflessness of it, overwhelmed him. He had spent years helping Theodorus, but he had never expected anything in return. He had done it because he saw potential, because he believed in the young man's character, because it felt right. But now, faced with Theodorus's offer, he realized something profound about the nature of true friendship. It wasn't about equality of exchange. It wasn't about keeping score or ensuring that favors were returned. True friendship was about seeing the best in someone and supporting them in becoming who they were meant to be. It was about standing beside them, not when it was convenient, but when it was needed. "Theodorus," Constantine said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "you honor me beyond measure, but I cannot take everything you have worked for. That would be wrong." Theodorus smiled, a gentle expression that lit up his whole face. "Mr. Papadakis, with respect, you are going to take it. Not because I'm forcing you, but because I'm asking you to trust me. Trust that I know what I'm doing. Trust that this is what I want. Trust that friendship sometimes means accepting help when it is offered with love." He leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious. "You have taught me many things about business, but the most important thing you taught me was about character. You taught me that a man's worth is not measured by his wealth or his success, but by how he treats others, especially when no one is watching. You taught me that integrity is not about following rules, but about doing what is right even when it is difficult. Theodorus gestured to the envelope again. This money is not just mine. It represents the lessons you taught me, the opportunities you gave me, the faith you showed in me. By accepting it, you are not taking from me. You are allowing me to honor what you have done for me. You are letting me become the person you believed I could be. As Constantine sat there, he realized that Theodorus had just taught him something invaluable about friendship. True friends don't keep score. They don't calculate whether their investment in the relationship will pay dividends. They don't abandon the ship when storms arise. Instead, they recognize that friendship is not a transaction, but a transformation, a mutual becoming that enriches both lives. He thought again about his other friends, Henri, Francois, Pierre, Jean-Paul. They had seen friendship as a business arrangement. They had been happy to accept his generosity when it benefited them, but they had calculated the risks of returning that generosity when he needed it. They had valued their own security more than their connection to him. But Theodorus had understood something deeper. He had seen friendship as a sacred trust, a responsibility that came with the privilege of being allowed into someone's life. He had understood that receiving help gracefully was as important as offering it freely. He had grasped that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to be generous with you. After a long moment, Constantine reached across the desk and grasped Theodorus's hand. "My friend," he said, using the word with new understanding, "I accept your gift, not because I am desperate, but because I understand now that refusing it would be refusing friendship itself. I accept it knowing that I can never repay this kindness, but hoping that I can honor it by being the kind of friend to you that you have been to me." Theodorus's face lit up with joy. "You have already been that friend, Mr. Papadakis. Every day for the past 5 years, you have been exactly the friend I needed. This is just my way of saying thank you." That afternoon, Constantine walked to the bank and withdrew the money to pay his supplier. The crisis passed, his business stabilized, and within 6 months he had not only repaid Theodorus, but had taken him on as a full partner in the expanding import business. But the real transformation was deeper than business recovery. Constantine had learned to distinguish between casual acquaintances and true friends. He had discovered that friendship is not about the number of people who call you friend, but about the depth of connection with those who truly care about your well-being. In the years that followed, Constantine and Theodorus built one of the most successful trading companies in Marseille. But more importantly, they built something even more valuable, a friendship based on the mutual respect, shared values, and unwavering loyalty. They weathered many storms together, both personal and professional, and each time they faced them as true partners. Years later, when Constantine was an old man, he would often tell visitors about the day he learned the difference between friends and true friends. He would explain that most people are fair weather companions, pleasant to have around when life is easy, but unreliable when challenges arise. But the few souls who will sacrifice their own comfort for your well-being, who will give everything they have to help you in your time of need, who will stand beside you not because they have to, but because they choose to. Those are the rare treasures that make life worth living." And he would always add, with a smile that spoke of deep wisdom, "I learned this lesson from a young man who arrived in Marseille with nothing but hope and left with everything he needed. The knowledge that true friendship is the greatest wealth of all." The year was 1943, and the streets of Krakow bore the scars of occupation. German soldiers patrolled the cobblestones with boots that echoed like warnings through the ancient Jewish quarter. Signs in both German and Polish declared curfews, restrictions, and punishments for those who dared defy the new order. The beauty of the medieval city, its soaring cathedral spires, its market square filled with merchants and storytellers, had been transformed into something that resembled a prison with pretensions of civilization. In the heart of this transformed city, in a modest apartment above a bakery that still somehow managed to produce bread despite the shortages, lived Dr. Helena Kowalska. She was a woman of 35 with steady brown eyes that had seen too much suffering and hands that had performed too many impossible procedures under impossible conditions. Her hair, once luxuriant and dark, was now prematurely streaked with gray from the stress of her work and the constant fear that gripped every moment of her life. Dr. Kowalska had been one of the most respected physicians in Krakow before the occupation. She had studied medicine in Vienna and Paris, returning to her hometown with dreams of serving the poor and healing the sick. She had established a clinic in the Old Quarter, where she treated everyone from wealthy merchants to street children, charging those who could pay and healing those who could not. But the occupation had changed everything. First, she had lost her clinic when the Germans declared that Jewish doctors could no longer practice medicine. Then, she had lost her apartment when her building was designated for German officers. She had been forced to move to this cramped space, sharing quarters with the baker's family, hiding her medical supplies in hollowed-out loaves of bread and false-bottom flour sacks. Yet even in these conditions, even with her practice officially forbidden, Dr. Kowalska continued to heal. She had become part of an underground network of Polish doctors who treated wounded resistance fighters, sick children, and anyone else in need. She worked in basements and attics, in cellars and hidden rooms, saving lives at risk to her own. The most dangerous part of her work wasn't the scarcity of medicine or the risk of German discovery. It was the moral complexity of her situation. The resistance fighters she treated were trying to kill German soldiers. The German soldiers sometimes came to her for treatment of injuries sustained in battle. Her Jewish patients were being hunted and killed. Her Polish patients were being forced into labor. Everyone in this city was someone's enemy, and yet everyone needed a doctor. On a cold February morning, as snow drifted against the windows of her hiding place, Dr. Kowalska heard a familiar knock. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. The code of the underground network. She opened the door to find Markin Nowak, a resistance fighter she had treated several times before. His face was pale and strained, and he supported himself against the doorframe. "Doctor," he gasped, "we need your help. Fast." Dr. Kowalska immediately began assessing him, noting his labored breathing and the way he favored his left side. "What happened?" "An ambush. We were trying to stop a supply convoy, but it was a trap. Several of my friends were hit. We managed to get them to safety, but he gestured weakly toward the window. They're in the old mill, the one that's been abandoned since before the war. But, Doctor, he paused, his expression troubled. There are German soldiers there, too, wounded from the same battle. Dr. Kowalska looked at him carefully. German soldiers? Markin nodded grimly. The ambush was designed to look like a trap for them. When they arrived, we hit them from multiple positions. Some of them are badly hurt. And, Doctor, he looked directly into her eyes, I need you to understand something. I know you treat everyone. I know you believe in healing regardless of nationality or politics, but these men, they're the same ones who executed civilians last month. They're the ones who destroyed the orphanage. They're the ones who murdered Janusz's family. Markin's voice grew harder. Some of my friends are saying we should let them die. They're saying it's justice. They're saying you should only treat our people. Dr. Kowalska closed her eyes, feeling the weight of this choice. In the 3 years since the occupation had begun, she had faced similar dilemmas repeatedly. A German officer with a broken leg who had shown mercy to a Polish family, a resistance fighter who had tortured information from a prisoner, a collaborator who had saved children from deportation. The lines between good and evil, between right and wrong, had become blurred beyond recognition. But she had always returned to the same principle that had guided her since medical school, her oath as a physician. She had sworn to do no harm and to treat the sick regardless of their background, their politics, or their actions. In the face of incomprehensible evil, she had chosen to hold onto the belief that healing was always the right choice. Markin, she said quietly, you know what I believe about this work. The young fighter nodded sadly. I know, but I had to ask. Some of the others are going to be very angry. Dr. Kowalska began gathering her medical supplies. The precious antibiotics hidden in the bottom of her bag, the morphine she had saved for the worst cases, the bandages she had washed and rewashed until they were threadbare. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind was occupied with the choice she had just made. The abandoned mill stood at the edge of the city, its broken windows like watching eyes. The resistance fighters had established a hideout in the lower level, accessible through a concealed entrance behind a collapsed wall. When Dr. Kowalska arrived, she found herself in a scene that perfectly captured the moral complexity of their situation. In one corner of the large room, 3 Polish resistance fighters lay on makeshift beds. A teenage boy named Piotr, with a bullet wound to his shoulder, a middle-aged man called Stefan, who had lost a lot of blood from a shrapnel injury, and their leader Janusz, who was conscious but in obvious pain from what appeared to be a broken rib. In the opposite corner, on beds that had been hastily prepared by the resistance fighters, lay 4 German soldiers. One was a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, his blonde hair and fair complexion making him look even younger in the dim light. His leg was wrapped in bandages that were already stained with blood. Another was an older sergeant, perhaps 40, with hands that showed the calluses of someone who had worked hard before the war. A third was a medic, recognizable by the medical bag that lay beside him. And the fourth was a captain, his uniform still bearing the insignia of his rank. The room was charged with tension. The Polish fighters watched the German prisoners with barely concealed hostility. The German soldiers lay still, their faces showing pain, but also resignation. They knew they were at the mercy of men they had been ordered to kill. The air was thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and something else. The weight of history and Chohin that filled every corner of the occupied city. Dr. Kowalska moved first to Piotr, the youngest of the Polish fighters. The boy's shoulder had been shattered by a bullet, and the wound needed immediate attention. As she worked, cleaning the injury and preparing to extract the bullet, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. "The captain says he recognizes you," Piotr whispered as she worked. "He says you saved his life last year." Dr. Kowalska glanced toward the German officer, who was indeed watching her with an expression she recognized. Captain Hermann Weiss had been brought to her 2 years ago, shot during a street a confrontation between German forces and Polish resistance. She had treated him without knowing his identity, and he had never revealed who he was. Now, in this moment of mutual vulnerability, the pretense was over. She finished treating Piotr and moved to Stefan, whose shrapnel wound was deeper and more complex. As she worked, she became aware that the German soldiers were watching her with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been respect. They had heard about the Polish doctor who treated anyone who needed healing, regardless of the circumstances. Now they were experiencing it firsthand. When she moved to the German soldiers, the tension in the room became almost tangible. Janusz, the Polish leader, spoke up from his bed. "Doctor," he said carefully, "some of my men think we shouldn't be giving medical help to the enemy." Dr. Kowalska didn't look up from the young German soldier's leg wound. "And what do you think, Janusz?" "I think," Janusz said slowly, "that if I were lying there bleeding, I'd want someone to help me. I think that healing isn't about politics. I think you're probably right." He paused, looking around the room. "But not everyone agrees with me." The young German soldier, whose name she learned was Klaus, spoke up in broken Polish. "I know what you are thinking about us. I know about the things my comrades have done. But I never wanted to be here. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I'm just a farmer's son from Bavaria. They told me I was fighting for Germany, but I never understood what that meant." Dr. Kowalska continued her work, but she was listening. The German medic, who identified himself as Franz, began to speak. "We all have stories we wish we didn't have to tell. I was studying to be a teacher before they drafted me. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But once you're in the army, once you're wearing the uniform, you don't have many choices." As Dr. Kowalska moved from patient to patient, treating wounds and providing comfort, a strange thing began to happen. The hostility in the room began to transform into something more complex. The Polish fighters began to see their enemies as individuals, young men far from home, forced into a war they hadn't chosen, carrying wounds that were as real and painful as their own. The German soldiers, for their part, began to see that the Poles they had been ordered to suppress were not the brutal enemies they had been told about, but human beings facing impossible choices with dignity and courage. Dr. Kowalska worked through the afternoon and into the evening, treating wounds, providing comfort, and witnessing something she had never seen before. Former enemies beginning to see each other as fellow human beings trapped in circumstances beyond their control. As she worked on Captain Weiss's broken arm, he spoke to her quietly. "You saved my life 2 years ago. I never told anyone. I never reported you to the authorities. I wanted to find a way to thank you." "And now?" Dr. Kowalska asked, not looking up from her work. "Now I understand why you did it. It's not about politics or nationalism or ideology. It's about something deeper. It's about the basic human recognition that we are all brothers and sisters, trapped in the same difficult world." Dr. Kowalska paused in her work and looked into his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean that we are all victims of something larger than ourselves. I am a victim of the madness that has taken over my country. You are a victim of the same madness, just from the other side. The boys lying here, Polish and German, we're all victims of the same evil that has made us enemies when we should be allies." His voice grew quieter. "When I was lying in that street 2 years ago, bleeding and afraid, you treated me like a human being. You didn't ask me about my politics or my orders. You just saw someone who was hurt and needed help. That moment taught me something about what it means to be a doctor and what it means to be human." As the evening progressed, something unprecedented began to happen in the old mill. The Polish fighters and the German soldiers began to talk to each other. They spoke in hushed voices about their homes, their families, their fears. They discovered shared experiences: the fear of death, the longing for peace, the desire to return to normal lives that seemed increasingly impossible. Stefan, the middle-aged Polish resistance fighter, found himself talking to Franz, the German medic, about their shared interest in literature. Janusz discovered that Klaus, the young German soldier, had been forced to leave a girlfriend behind when he was drafted. Piotr, despite his youth, began to understand that the German soldiers were not monsters, but young men caught in a war they hadn't chosen. Dr. Kowalska continued her work, but she was aware that something more important than physical healing was taking place. The barriers between enemies were beginning to break down, not because the circumstances had changed, but because people were beginning to see each other as individuals rather than as symbols of opposing forces. As the night wore on, she realized that this was what she had been trying to accomplish through her work all along. Not just healing bodies, but healing the divisions that made healing so difficult. Not just treating wounds, but treating the deeper wound of hatred and fear that was tearing their world apart. When she finally finished her work and began to pack her supplies, Captain Weiss called to her. "Doctor, may I speak with you privately?" She moved to where he lay, and he struggled to sit up despite his broken arm. "I want you to know that what you did here tonight, treating all of us regardless of our uniforms, means something to me. It reminds me of the man I was before the war, the man I want to be again." He looked around the room at the Polish fighters, who were now talking quietly with his own men. "These boys, your friends and mine, we are all caught in something terrible. But tonight, for a few hours, we remembered that we are more than the uniforms we wear. We are more than the orders we follow. We are human beings who can choose to see each other with compassion instead of hatred." He paused, his voice growing stronger. "I cannot promise that I will stop fighting for my country. I cannot promise that I will refuse orders or desert my post. But I can promise you this: I will remember tonight. I will remember that there are doctors like you who see past the uniforms and the politics to the human beings underneath." and perhaps that memory will help me make better choices when the time comes. Dr. Kowalska looked around the room at the extraordinary scene before her. Former enemies sharing stories, Polish fighters and German soldiers, discovering common ground, the wounded and the healers, all united in the simple recognition of shared humanity. "Captain Weiss," she said quietly, "I want you to know that tonight you taught me something as well. You taught me that healing is not just about setting bones or suturing wounds. Sometimes healing is about creating moments where people can remember their better selves. Sometimes healing is about giving people a chance to see each other as human beings instead of as symbols of everything they fear or hate." She gathered her medical bag and prepared to leave, but she paused at the door. "When this war is over, when we can look back on these times with clearer eyes, I hope we will remember that there were moments like this. Moments when enemies could set aside their differences and recognize each other as fellow travelers on a difficult journey." As she made her way back through the dark streets of Krakow, Dr. Kowalska reflected on what had happened in the old mill. She had treated wounds and saved lives, but she had also witnessed something that gave her hope for the future. She had seen that even in the midst of the most terrible conflict, even when hatred seemed to have conquered everything else, people could still choose compassion. They could still choose to see each other as individuals worthy of care and respect. In the months that followed, the war continued its brutal course. Dr. Kowalska continued her underground work, treating resistance fighters and German soldiers, Polish civilians and Jewish families, anyone who needed healing. She never spoke publicly about what had happened in the mill, but she never forgot it either. Years later, when the war had ended and Krakow had been rebuilt, she would often think about Captain Weiss and the young German soldiers she had treated. Some had survived the war and returned home. Others had not. But all of them, she believed, had been touched by something that night. The recognition that healing was possible even in the midst of the most terrible circumstances. And she would remember that her greatest healing work had not been the surgeries or the treatments, but the moments when she had helped former enemies see each other as human beings. Those moments of recognition, those glimpses of shared humanity, had been the most important medicine she had ever administered. The year was 1962, and the small Italian village of San Benedetto, nestled in the mountains of Tuscany, like a secret kept safe by time. Narrow stone streets wound between ancient houses with red-tiled roofs and walls that had been weathered by centuries of wind and rain. The village square centered around a fountain that had been built in the 15th century, its water flowing with the gentle sound that had marked the rhythm of village life for generations. In the heart of this timeless place, in a small house with windows that looked out over olive groves and vineyards, lived Benedetta Rossi. She was a woman of 78 years, with silver hair that caught the morning light like threads of silk, and eyes that had seen the full span of a century's worth of joy and sorrow. Her face, lined with the delicate tracery of age, carried the expression of someone who had learned to find peace in the simple rhythms of daily life. Benedetta had been born in San Benedetto, married a local farmer, raised 4 children who had all moved to the cities for work, and buried her husband 15 years ago when the influenza had swept through the village. She had lived through 2 world wars, the rise and fall of fascism, the transformation of Italy from an agricultural nation to an industrial power, and the gradual emptying of rural villages as young people sought opportunities in the cities. Now, in the early 1960s, San Benedetto was a shadow of its former self. What had once been a thriving community of nearly 800 people had dwindled to fewer than 200 residents, most of them elderly. The young people had left for Milan, Rome, Turin, anywhere that offered the promise of a better life than working the land that their ancestors had farmed for centuries. Benedetto's own children had followed this pattern. Giuseppe had become an engineer in Milan, married a northern woman, and raised 3 children who spoke better Milanese dialect than the Tuscan of their grandmother. Maria had married a businessman in Rome and devoted herself to raising 5 children of her own. Luigi had moved to Turin to work in the automobile factories, building Fiats while his own son learned to fix machines rather than tend vineyards. Teresa had become a teacher in Florence, teaching literature to students who had never seen an olive tree. All of them had invited Benedetta to come live with them. All of them had offered comfortable apartments, city amenities, the company of grandchildren who would benefit from her wisdom and experience. But Benedetta had declined every invitation. This village, these mountains, this old house with its thick stone walls and its memories of 7 decades of life, this was home. This was where she belonged. She had learned to live alone without being lonely. Each morning, she would rise before dawn and tend her small garden, growing vegetables that fed her and flowers that brightened the village square. She would walk to the market in the square, where the remaining shopkeepers still knew her by name and still gave her the best of their wares without charge. She would visit the elderly neighbors who, like her, had chosen to remain in San Benedetto rather than follow their children to the cities. The rhythm of her days was simple but satisfying. Morning prayers in the small church where she had been married 50 years ago. Midday meals shared with whichever neighbors felt like company. Afternoon walks through the countryside gathering herbs and wildflowers, talking to the old oak trees that had watched over the village for centuries. Evening reading by the oil lamp, the same lamp her grandmother had used, telling stories to the shadows on the walls. But even this peaceful routine was beginning to change. The village was getting smaller and older each year. The post office had closed. The school had been converted to a community center. The bakery that had served 3 generations of families now opened only 3 days a week. One by one, the familiar faces were disappearing either to the cities or to the cemetery that grew larger each year. Benedetta understood that she was witnessing the end of something precious, the kind of community that had sustained humanity for thousands of years, where neighbors knew each other's histories, where children played in the streets under the watchful eyes of entire neighborhoods, where festivals and traditions linked generations in an unbroken chain of shared experience. Yet she had chosen to remain not because she was stubborn or because she couldn't adapt to change, but because she understood something that the younger generation had forgotten. She understood that communities are not built by institutions or by grand plans, but by the daily choices of people who decide to care for each other. She understood that the bonds between neighbors, between friends, between the generations are not maintained automatically, but require constant attention and renewal. And so Benedetta had made it her life's work to maintain those bonds. Not through grand gestures or official positions, but through the small daily acts of kindness that hold communities together. She brought soup to neighbors who were ill. She watched the children of working mothers during the day. She tended the graves of those who had no family left to visit them. She preserved the village's traditions, the festivals, the recipes, the stories, and passed them on to anyone who showed interest. But as the years passed and the village continued to empty, even Benedetta began to wonder if her efforts were enough. Was it possible to maintain a community when there were fewer and fewer people left to be community? Was it worth trying to preserve something that seemed destined to disappear? The answer came to her one autumn evening in 1962 when she heard a knock at her door that was neither familiar nor threatening. She opened it to find a young woman standing in the doorway, holding a small child and carrying a suitcase that had seen better days. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark hair and eyes that spoke of recent tears. The child, a boy of perhaps 3, clung to her neck and looked around the unfamiliar surroundings with the wariness of someone who had experienced too much change in too short a time. "Scusi," the woman said, in a voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry to disturb you. My name is Elena Moretti. My husband died 3 months ago. We had nowhere else to go, and someone told me that San Benedetto might have work for people willing to farm the land." Benedetta looked at the woman and child with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades reading the stories written in people's faces. She saw exhaustion, grief, and something else. Determination mixed with desperation. "Come in," Benedetta said simply, stepping aside to let them enter. "You must be tired from your journey." Elena and her son Pietro entered the small house, and Benedetta immediately felt the familiar sensation that had guided her throughout her life. The recognition that someone needed help, and the understanding that helping them was exactly what she was meant to do. Over the following days, Benedetta learned Elena's story. She had been born in a village in southern Italy, married young to a man who had promised to give her a better life. They had moved north for work, first to Rome, then to Milan, then to Turin, following the promise of prosperity that seemed always just out of reach. Her husband had been a construction worker, building the new Italy that was emerging from the ruins of war, but he had been killed in an accident at a building site, leaving Elena and Pietro alone and desperate. "I don't know anything about farming," Elena confessed to Benedetta as they sat in the small kitchen sharing a pot of soup. "I never had a garden, never grew anything. But someone said that the land here is good and that people might be willing to share what they know." Benedetta nodded thoughtfully. "The land here has been good to people for hundreds of years. But it's not just about knowing how to farm. It's about understanding that the land will only give you what you give to it. It's about patience and hard work and accepting that some years are good and some years are hard." She looked at Elena's hands, soft hands that had never known the calluses of honest labor. "But more than that, it's about community. No one can farm alone in these mountains. You need neighbors who will share their knowledge, their tools, their help when storms come or when harvests need to be brought in quickly." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "I don't have neighbors. I don't have family. I don't have anyone to help me." "But you have me," Benedetta said simply. "And if you stay, you will have others. It takes time to build community, but once it's built, it's stronger than anything else in the world." What happened next surprised even Benedetta herself. Instead of simply offering advice or directions to the employment office in the nearest town, she invited Elena and Pietro to stay with her. Not as charity, not as temporary help, but as an arrangement that would benefit them both. "I have a spare room," she said. "You can help me with the garden, and I'll teach you what you need to know about farming. Pietro can play in the village while we work. It will be good for all of us." Elena stared at her in amazement. "You would do that? For people you just met?" "My dear child," Benedetta said with a smile, "I've learned something in my 78 years. Family is not just who you're born to or who you're married to. Family is who chooses to stand beside you when life becomes difficult. It's who shares their bread when you're hungry, their roof when you have nowhere to sleep, their knowledge when you need to learn something new." And so, Elena and Pietro moved into Benedetta's house. At first, it was awkward. Two women from different generations, different backgrounds, different experiences of life, learning to share space and routines. Elena was accustomed to city life, to anonymity and independence. Benedetta was used to the rhythms of rural life, to knowing everyone's business and everyone knowing hers. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something beautiful began to develop. Elena discovered that she had a natural gift for growing things. Under Benedetta's patient guidance, she learned to prepare soil, to plant seeds, to tend young plants with the careful attention they needed to survive in the mountain climate. Her hands, soft from years of factory work, gradually developed the calluses and sensitivity that every farmer needs. Pietro, meanwhile, found himself in a world completely different from the crowded apartment buildings and noisy streets where he had spent his short life. In San Benedetto, he could play freely in the streets and squares with neighbors who watched over him with the same care they would have given their own children. He learned to climb olive trees, to pick vegetables, to help in the garden, to tend the chickens that Benedetta kept for eggs. And Benedetta discovered something she had forgotten: the joy of having young people in her house again, of sharing her knowledge with someone eager to learn, of experiencing the world through the eyes of a child who saw everything as an adventure. The arrangement worked so well that when Elena mentioned that she had heard of another family who might be interested in moving to San Benedetto, Benedetta immediately offered to help. This family, the Bertonis, had lost their farm in the Po Valley to development and were looking for somewhere they could start over. Within a year, the Bertonis had arrived: Giovanni and Maria Bertoni and their 3 children aged 4, 8, and 12. They were experienced farmers, and under their capable hands, the abandoned fields around the village began to come back to life. Their children brought new energy to the village, playing in the square, helping with farm work, and bringing their own traditions from the north that enriched the existing community. When Maria Bertoni mentioned that her brother might be interested in moving to the area, Benedetta found herself offering to help him as well. Soon, another family arrived: the Castelluccis, who had been displaced by industrial development in their own region. They brought with them skills in woodworking and metalwork, and they began to repair and improve the old buildings that had been falling into disrepair. Word spread through the networks of displaced rural families, people who had lost their connection to the land, who were looking for somewhere to rebuild their lives, who possessed the skills and determination needed to make a new beginning. One by one, they came to San Benedetto, drawn by stories of a place where people still helped each other, where land was available for those willing to work it, where the elderly shared their wisdom with the young. But it wasn't just the newcomers who were drawn to San Benedetto. Some of the villagers who had moved to the cities began to return. Giuseppe, Benedetta's own son, visited more frequently and eventually announced that he was considering moving back to start a small engineering business that would serve the growing community. Maria began talking about retiring early and coming home to write her memoirs. Luigi started a small automobile repair shop that served not just the village but the surrounding area. Within 5 years, San Benedetto had grown from fewer than 200 residents to more than 400. The village square was once again filled with children playing, with vendors selling their wares, with the sounds of normal life that had seemed destined for extinction. But the transformation was deeper than just population growth. What had emerged was a new kind of community. Not the traditional rural village where everyone had known everyone else for generations, but something that was perhaps even stronger. It was a community where people had chosen to be together, where the bonds between them were based not on accident of birth or geographic proximity, but on shared values and mutual commitment. Elena, now confident in her farming abilities and respected by her neighbors, had become one of the community's leaders. She organized the farmers' cooperative that had grown out of the informal arrangements that Benedetta had encouraged. The Bertonis had built a small processing facility where the community's agricultural products could be prepared for market. The Castelluccis had created workshops that served both the local population and visitors from the cities who were beginning to discover the beauty of rural Tuscany. And Benedetta, now in her 80s but still vital and engaged, had become the unofficial grandmother of the entire community. Children from all the families knew they could come to her with their problems. Parents sought her advice on everything from crop rotation to child rearing. The elderly neighbors who had chosen to remain in San Benedetto found themselves surrounded by a new generation that honored their wisdom and respected their experiences. But the most beautiful thing about this transformation was that it had been achieved not through grand planning or outside investment, but through the simple, daily choices of people who decided to care for each other. Benedetta had never set out to rebuild San Benedetto. She had simply done what she had always done, offering help to anyone who needed it, sharing what she had with anyone who lacked, treating strangers as potential friends rather than as threats or competitors. The result had been something that surprised even the experts who studied rural development. A dying village had been reborn not through tourism or industrial development, but through the revival of the ancient art of community, the art of neighbors helping neighbors, of different families coming together to create something stronger than any of them could have created alone. Years later, when Benedetta was asked to speak at a conference about rural revitalization, she tried to explain what had happened in San Benedetto. She spoke about the importance of treating strangers as potential friends rather than as threats. She talked about the power of small, daily acts of kindness to create lasting change. She explained how the bonds between people who choose to help each other can be stronger than the bonds between people who are simply born into the same place. The secret, she said to the assembled academics and development experts, is understanding that community is not something that happens to you. It's something you create through your daily choices. When you see someone who needs help, you help them. When you see someone who is lonely, you include them. When you see someone who is struggling, you share what you have. She paused, looking out at the audience of people who had come to learn about community development from books and theories and case studies. The ancient Romans had a saying, amor vincit omnia. Love conquers all. I think what they meant was that when people choose to care for each other, when they choose to build each other up instead of tearing each other down, when they choose to see each other as potential friends rather than as threats, then they can accomplish things that would be impossible for them to achieve alone. But love, she added with a gentle smile, is not just a feeling. Love is a choice. Love is what you do every day when you decide to be kind instead of cruel, to include instead of exclude, to help instead of harm. Love is what you choose when you decide that the stranger at your door might become your friend and that your friend might become your family. As the years continued to pass, and as San Benedetto grew into a thriving community that had managed to preserve the best of its rural traditions while embracing the opportunities of modern life, Benedetta often reflected on the lesson she had learned. She had discovered that the most powerful force in the world is not money or technology or political power, but the simple choice to care for someone else. She had learned that the elderly are not burdens to be discarded, but treasures to be valued, not because they are weak, but because they are wise. She had learned that newcomers are not threats to be feared, but opportunities to embrace. Not because they are perfect, but because they bring new perspectives and new energy. She had learned that communities are not built by institutions or by plans, but by the daily choices of people who decide to see each other as potential friends rather than as competitors. And most importantly, she had learned that family is not just who you're born to or who you're married to, but who chooses to stand beside you when life becomes difficult, who shares their bread when you're hungry, who offers their knowledge when you need to learn something new, who includes you in their lives when you have nowhere else to go. And so, my dear friend, we come to the end of our 3 tales of true friendship. 3 stories about souls who discovered what it means to be truly known, truly accepted, and truly valued for who they are at their core. We met Constantine, the merchant who learned the difference between fair weather friends and those who stand beside you when storms arise. He discovered that true friendship is not about equality of exchange, but about the willingness to sacrifice your own comfort for the well-being of someone you care about. He learned that the greatest wealth is not in coins or goods, but in the bonds between people who choose to help each other without keeping score. We met Dr. Kowalska, the healer, who treated enemies and discovered that sometimes the most important medicine is not a pill or a procedure, but the recognition of shared humanity. She learned that even in the midst of the most terrible conflicts, people can still choose compassion. She discovered that healing is not just about setting bones or suturing wounds, but about creating moments where people can remember their better selves. And we met Benedetta, the elderly woman who built a new family from strangers and discovered that community is not something that happens to you, but something you create through your daily choices. She learned that the most powerful force in the world is the simple choice to care for someone else, to treat strangers as potential friends rather than as threats. 3 stories, 3 different times, 3 different places, but the same timeless truth running through them all. True friendship is the sacred art of seeing the best in someone and supporting them in becoming who they are meant to be. What did these 3 souls teach us? They taught us that friends are not just people who make us feel good about ourselves. True friends are people who challenge us to grow, who support us when we face difficulties, who stand beside us not because they have to, but because they choose to. They taught us that friendship is not a transaction, but a transformation, a mutual becoming that enriches both lives. They showed us that the bonds between people who choose to care for each other can be stronger than blood ties, more reliable than business partnerships, more enduring than political alliances. Most importantly, they revealed to us that the secret to finding true friends is becoming the kind of person others would want as a friend. It is treating strangers as potential friends, offering help without expecting reward, standing beside those who need support, and choosing compassion over convenience. As you drift now into sleep, let these stories settle into your heart like seeds in fertile ground. Perhaps you will recognize in them faces from your own life, people who have stood beside you, who have offered help without being asked, who have seen you at your worst and chosen to remain your friend anyway. Perhaps you will remember times when you have been that kind of friend to others, when you have chosen to help rather than to judge, to include rather than exclude, to stand beside someone when they needed support. And perhaps as you dream, you will imagine new friendships waiting to be discovered, new opportunities to show kindness to strangers, new chances to build community through the simple daily choice to care for someone else. Remember always that friendship is not about finding perfect people, but about seeing the perfect potential in imperfect people. It is about accepting others as they are while encouraging them to become who they might be. It is about being present for others in their struggles without trying to fix their problems, offering support without taking away their agency, and loving unconditionally without demanding anything in return. Sleep well, my dear friend. Sleep deeply. And know that whatever you face in your waking hours, you carry within you the power to be the kind of friend that others need, the kind of person who makes the world a little brighter, a little kinder, a little more connected. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the warmth of true friendship.